Hello, hello.
Hi, Carol. How you doing?
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Shell.
Hi.
So Carol, I'm gonna write to Ricky as well. I would like to know who I should speak to at Fox Hills if I want to come and do like a lecture series. I mean, we have a lot of members there, and it would be appropriate for me to come. And again, it's a kind of an outreach. We know that outreach has not always worked. On the other hand, it's often worked very well. I mean, we seem to be getting a number of people because they know all of our members.
Hmm.
So,
Okay. Yeah, I had no idea who to speak to, but
okay, I'll check with Ricky or
yeah, I mean,
Bill.
I guess the office would be the main
Yeah.
place to start. Yeah, or we have a Jewish group called Chaverim,
Hmm.
um, because I know Rabbi, the one from Chabad, the son-in-law.
Rabbi Mendelson,
No, no,
Rabbi Baumgarten.
mm-mm. No, the son-in-law. It's the daughter's husband, so he's young. Like can't think of his name.
Oh, yeah, Stissel. Not
It's not
Stissel. That's the show.
whatever.
Stiefel.
Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah, they and he lives in the lake.
right.
Yeah, so that's on Wednesdays. I've never gone there, but okay,
Yeah,
I'll find out what I can.
yeah. Or if the person from Chaverim wants to talk to me, or I mean, I'll call them, obviously. I'm more than happy to okay. I'm gonna start sharing. And again, move everything around so I can
Hmm.
okay, I think I'm already there.
Mm-hmm.
The right size. Good morning, Yehudi, or good afternoon at this
Okay,
point.
so Robert Papi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
All right.
Yeah,
If you're alive, you're all right.
that's always a good thing. Uh,
Better believe it.
my daughter was pointing out to me in the car, she was playing her music, and the lyrics from a guy, Pitbull, who's not, I wouldn't necessarily refer to him for great music or even beautiful lyrics, but he has, some inspiring things, and he's, something like, any any day you're not underground is good, or things like that, something like that. So I said, yeah, that's true. Hi,
Listen,
Rabbi Zucker,
man.
how you doing?
Afternoon, good.
Shalom, Rob Zucker, how are you? And Shalom, Shal, I didn't see you, but I know you're there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Well, he's with us only for a short time,
Yeah.
since he's leaving for Japan tomorrow.
Yeah.
And again, I'll wish you and Nancy a Nasiya
Thank you.
Tova.
Thanks.
Malash.
Okay, so we go on in Parashat in Sefer Devarim, which really is almost one extended sermon. Yes, it's divided, as three speeches to Moshe, but scholars have pointed out there seem to be a couple of beginnings, and it's very sermonic in tone. And as we'll come back to, there's a language, and we've mentioned this many, many, many times, a language peculiar, or I should say unique to Deuteronomy. And Moshe Weinfeld, who did the commentary on Sefer Devarim for Anchor Bible, at least the first 11 chapters, in his classic work, Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomic School, uh, outlined some of that language. I mean, well, not some of it, but he was very, very careful in pointing out, and it comes through in his commentary as well. And later commentaries use his research and the research of others. So Deuteronomy very much stands on its own, but as we'll see, it's not totally on its own. It clearly is drawing on traditions from elsewhere in the Torah. Some of them have greater influence than others. So we may get a little bit into the weeds here of different theories about the Bible. But nonetheless, it's important to recognize what's going on with the Devarim, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So first of all, I'm going to begin with one verse. Again, Moshe is reviewing the history, and the last week we had the review of the Aseret HaDibrot or Aseret HaDvarim. He's going on now talking about their wanderings in the wilderness, and we come to this line. Who would like to read?
I'll read.
Okay, thank you, Carol.
The children of Israel marched from the wells of Bnei Yakan to Mosera. There Aaron died, and he was buried there, and Eleazar his son served as priest in his stead.
Okay, so first of all, the Hebrew is Be'erot B'nei Yakan, the wells of B'nei Yakan, is how they translate it here. Now, what should hit us immediately with this? I mean, there are a number of things, but there's one thing in particular that should stand out as we read this.
The death of Aaron?
Right, the death of Aharon. But where does it take place according to this?
At the wells of Bnei
Well,
Yakan.
actually, at Mosera.
Mosera, yeah, and
Yeah.
not in Har Nevo or
No, Hor HaHar.
Nobody ever said
Har.
he was buried at Harnaval. What it did say is that he died at Har. Of course, we don't really know where either one of these places are. So
Yeah.
unless Rabbi Zucker wants to contribute something. Rabbi
So,
Zucker, are you there?
I did not do any excavating or traveling east of the Jordan River.
Okay, just this.
So, anyway, again, this stands out because we always think of Aaron dying at Hor HaHar, and in fact, we read that not too long ago. So, let's take a look back at what we read in Bamidbar and compare it to what we're reading here in Devarim. Go ahead, Carol. This is now in Bamidbar.
Okay. They marched on from Bnei Yakan and encamped. No,
They marched on from
Moserot and encamped at Bnei Yakan.
yeah, the opposite of what we saw above. Go on.
They marched on from Bnei Yakan and encamped at Hor HaGidgad. They marched on from Hor HaGidgad and encamped at Yotvata. They marched on from Yotvata and encamped at Avrona. They marched on from Avrona and encamped at Etzion Gever. They marched on from Etzion Gever and encamped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. They marched on from Kadesh and encamped at Hor HaHa, at the edge of the land of Edom.
Okay, so this, between, in Bamidbar, in Devarim, we have Israel going from Bnei Yakan to Mosera, and there Aharon dies. But here it seems to be very, very different. There are a number of places before they get to Hor HaHar, and again, the section that we're generally familiar with as it goes on in Bamidbar. Now Aharon.
Oh, now Aharon the priest went up Hor HaHar by order of Hashem and died there in the 40th year after the going out of the children of Israel from the land of Egypt. In the 5th month, on the 1st of the month, Aharon was 23 and 100 years old when he died at Hor HaHar.
So we have in our pasuk, the pasuk from our parasha, what seems to be a contradiction to what we have on the Midbar. So we're going to first look at a couple of our traditional Meforshim, how they try and resolve this discrepancy. Now, by the way, as Yehuda said, we really don't even know where most of these places are. And I always kind of felt, because of the character of some of these names, that I'm not sure they ever really existed.
Hmm.
They may very well have, by the way. It's not, I think for the people who are reading the initial readers of the Torah or listeners would have recognized some of these places or not. Okay. So here's Rashi's attempt to resolve this.
The children of Israel marched from the wells of Bnei Yakan to Mosera. What has this matter to do with what has been related here? Further, did they indeed journey from the wells of Bnei Yakan to Mosera? Did they not come from Mosera to the wells of Bnei Yakan? As it is said in Numbers, they marched on from Bnei Yakan, etc. And further, it states here, there Aharon died. But did he not die at Hor HaHar?
So we have a couple of questions that Rashi raises. Why are they talking about this here in Deuteronomy? And it does seem to contradict a number of the verses in Bamidbar. So here is his resolution.
Okay.
Yeah, go and count.
Go and count, and you will find that there are 8 stations from Mosera to Mount Hor. But really, this also is part of the reproof by Moses.
Because this is, by the way, Moshe is complaining to the people about their stubbornness and how they've turned away from God at various times. Go on.
In effect, he said, this also you did. When Aaron died on Hor HaHar at the end of 40 years, and the clouds of divine glory departed, you feared war with the king of Arad, and you appointed a leader that you might return to Egypt. And you turned backwards 8 stages into Bnei Yakan, and hence to Mosera. There the sons of Levi fought with you, and they slew some of you, and you some of them, until they forced you back on the road
Along
which you had retreated. From there, Mosera, you returned to Gudgoda. That is identical with the Hagidgod, with or Hagidgod.
Yeah. So what is Rashi's answer? How could, this other itinerary seem to be correct? What had Israel done?
They turned backwards.
Right, they turned backwards. We know that after Haron dies, they're attacked by the king of Arad. It says Vayishma Melech Arad, the king of Arad heard, and for our commentators, for the Midrash, what did they hear? That Aharon died, so he figured Israel were weaker, and he attacked them. But basically, Israel wanted to go back. They were scared, and they did go back, and they had to retrace their steps. So that's Rashi's answer. Nice try. He's building on the Midrash there. Okay, now let's take a look at Ibn Ezra.
Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, unless anybody else wants
Yeah,
to.
I can read if you want.
Okay, thanks,
No
Joe.
big deal. The children of Israel marched from the wells of Bnei Yakan to Mosera. This verse is placed here because Moses said, and I prayed for Aaron also the same time.
Yeah, so basically, he's first of all answering the question of what is this section doing here? I said, well, Moshe remembering how he prayed, because we're about to talk about this, so I should have mentioned that Israel rebelling against God is the story of the Egel Masecha. And of course, Aharon was guilty in that incident. And Moshe is mentioning, I prayed for Aharon at that time, just as I prayed for you, because God was angry. And that's why this section is here, because it was mentioned that Moshe prayed for Aharon. Go on.
Moshe indicated that Aaron did not die until the 40th year. The proof that its meaning is that, as Moses said, at that time, the Hashem separated the tribe of Levi, which took place at Mount Sinai, as I explained in the Torah portion, which opens with, and Hashem spoke.
Yeah, the beginning of Numbers. The tribe of Levi is distinguished from the other tribes. They're separated. And going on.
The early authorities tell us that Israel backtracked. However, what shall we do with the clause, there Aaron died and there he was buried? Rabbi Isaac ibn
Giyat.
Giyat the Spaniard of blessed memory says that the meaning of Sham there is then. He says that Misham from thence, in Misham Ro'eh from thence from the shepherd, is similar. There
Yeah,
is
he's
no
basically explaining how we could use this word sham, not necessarily in a sense of space, but in a temporal sense, from time. That's his explanation. Yitzchak ibn Giyat. But Ibn Ezra, sorry, goes on.
There is no need for this interpretation. On the contrary, I believe that the wells of Benai Yakan is not to be identified with Benai Yakan, neither is Mosera the same as Moserat. In reality, Kadesh is called the wilderness of wells of Benai Yakan, and the wilderness of Hor Haha is called Moserah. There are many such examples. Do you not see that scripture says the wilderness of Shur, but in another verse as the wilderness of Etam?
Yeah. So basically, Ibn Ezra's way of dealing with this is how is he dealing with the problem?
He's
This
making them the
state.
same.
Pardon me?
He's making them the same.
Yeah, either that, well, or not necessarily the same. He's, explaining, that the earlier, the regular identification is not necessarily correct.
Yeah.
And we have plenty of examples in Tanakh where where places have different names.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so that's his way of dealing with it.
That was
Now,
Ibn Ezra.
Ibn Ezra.
Right.
So for Rashi is drawing on the Midrash and the Talmud that Israel revolted and they tried to go back and they started going back, but then they had to go forward again, hence the different itineraries. One was the first time and the other was the second time. And then you have Ibn Ezra, though he may not agree with Ibn Giyat, he quotes him, so obviously he thinks it's worthwhile on some level. That perhaps we can understand the word sham in temporally but his answer is that, well, we think that these are all the same names. They're not. I mean, they might be the same names, but they're not necessarily the same places, and we know that places have different names. Okay, so now we come to Rashi's grandson, Rashbam, who was even more of a Pashtan, trying to go for the simple explanation than his grandfather, at least so he says. Go ahead, the children of Israel.
Yes, the children of Israel marched from the wells of Bnei Ya'akan. If you were to say to me, and I prayed for Aaron, also the same time at the beginning of the 40 years, yet we know that Aaron died. So what good are your prayers? Moshe answered them, it was not at the beginning of the 40 did Aaron die because of the event of the calf,
Yeah, the calf, the golden calf.
golden calf, but he only died at the end of 40 at Har Hahar, at the time when we journeyed from the wells of Bnei Yaakan, to which we came from Moserat, as is written in the wanderings. The children of Israel marched from the wells of Bnei Yaakan and camped at Moserah. They marched on from there until Hor Haha. There Aaron died, not at the event of the calf.
So Rashbam is emphasizing that, this mention of Aharon is demonstrating that what Moshe is saying is he didn't die way back at the beginning of our wanderings with the incident of Egel HaMasecha, the molten calf, but he really did die at the end of our wanderings, at the end of the 40 years. So we have all of these answers that are, okay, they're attempts to answer this question. Now, contemporary Mefarshim are going to have slightly different answers because as we recognize, and we've mentioned this before, how Sefer Devarim stands apart from the other books of the Torah, what do we sometimes call the Tetratuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It has its own style, its own particular concerns that are not necessarily the same as the previous books of the Torah. Nonetheless, it certainly is drawing on many of those traditions. And we'll see a little bit how that these traditions may have been woven into what we have, what we have in Devarim, how it drew on earlier traditions and yet are not necessarily the same. So first of all, from Weinfeld, this is from his Anchor Bible commentary in the first 11 chapters of Devarim.
These verses in which Israel is spoken about in the third person and not in the second person, as is usual in the speech of Moshe, interrupt the account of the ark with its tablets and the passage about the Levites, the bearers of the ark. It seems to be an excerpt of the Elohist.
Oh, sorry, that should be Elohist.
Elohist.
It's only if a commentator is drunk.
Well, Elohist, source from which Deuteronomy drew its traditions. It was inserted here because of the information about Aharon and Eleazar, who were the first Levites consecrated to priesthood.
So here, on one hand, Weinfeld agrees with the traditional Mefarshim that this section is placed here because it's it's got information about Aharon and Eleazar, and that really does fit in within the context. Also, it should be mentioned, Weinfeld makes a big thing. If you follow along carefully on Shabbat, we have Moshe describing how he made an Aharon of eights of wood for the luchot, for the tablets. Interestingly, he just talks about an Aharon of eights of wood, does not go into all the descriptions that we have of the Aharon back in Shemot. There's no mention here of the kaporet, the cover on the ark with the kruvim, with the cherubim.
Because the essence of it, and we pointed this out some time ago.
Yeah.
It starts with Yoshua, Aaron, Isaiah, Shittim. Everything else is commentary. You know what I'm saying? In other words, the Varim strips it down to the essence. Shemot
Right.
gives you all the frills.
Yeah. Actually, Weinfeld makes the point that in general, Devarim is a much more secular work, if you will. It's not concerned with all the ritual and sacred details that understandably are very much part of the priestly writings. Also, he points out is that within the priestly circles, of course, from where does God speak to Moses?
From above the
Yeah.
God was in effect seated on
Right.
On the kaporet,
Yeah.
on the lid of the ark.
Right. So that was, that's where God spoke to him. God was, as it were, seated upon it. However, in Devarim, there's a further abstraction. You don't have the notion of God seated or God having a throne.
God isn't even Devarim. God isn't even on earth at all.
Right. And in fact,
Only God's name.
yeah, right, exactly, God's
But
name.
not his name, his reputation, his
Yeah,
presence. Don't
but
translate as or Shakeh Shemo as his name. That's not what it means. You know that, Professor.
well, the point being that they're abstracting it. It's not even a presence, but simply, they won't even use that language, but just they use the language l'shakain shmo sham, to cause his name to dwell there. Yes, it might mean reputation, but so there's a greater abstraction that is.
Designation would work, you know, but that's all. It doesn't mean that, in other words, yes, it's clearly conceived though differently. In fact, to tell you the truth, that would be, I'm having a very hard time understanding where exactly you intend to take us with this discussion of the contradiction here, if there is one, between these two sections, because I think this is a crux. I think it's been known to be a crux, for the last at least 2,000 years. And unless you got a solution for it, it would seem to me maybe more sense to talk about what you just started to speak about, which is the difference between D and, let's say, P on the issue of Hashem's presence.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's
Summer goes
part of
into that, and it's major difference.
I'm saying, but that's an issue. This one, we don't have enough facts to come to any serious conclusion about what's going on with B'nai Yaakov, Sarah, and all this other stuff. We just don't. So, as a practical matter, you can speculate about it all you want, but I don't see how you're going to end up with anything that's going to really solve the problem with the present state of knowledge that we have.
I'm not going to
The other thing, if you look in this week's Torah.com, Dudu Cohen, graduate of PhD from the Hebrew University in Tanakh, suggests that Kaddish is not in the Negev on the edge of the area of the Egyptian Israeli border of today, but rather in the area of Petra. It's complete different geographic understanding.
You don't mean Kaddish, you mean Kadesh Barnea. Isn't that what you mean? You said Kaddish, but you mean
look at the article. It's really quite different than he's a geographer. So
I have a problem with saying that Kadesh Barnea is somewhere in the Arava, which means below.
No, but he's suggesting it's east of in the area of Petra.
Yeah. So
the Edomite heartlands, Edomite highlands.
Yeah. So I mean, I all that is, I think very important. And part of our discussion here is to recognize that we don't know where most of these things are.
Absolutely.
For all of the details that we have, we don't know precisely where these places are. Mm-hmm. And I would say that to some extent, some of these places may not have existed, and they've got, I think they are playing on names a little bit here, but that's just my, don't take it seriously. So let's go on. The itinerary.
Sure. The itinerary which parallels, in general, the itinerary in Numbers priestly source differs from the text at several points. For one, the itinerary is styled in the style of J.E.
Yeah. So again, we have these documents, in the documentary hypothesis, there are 4 documents: J, the Yahwist source, E, the Elohist source, P, the priestly sources, and D, Deuteronomy. JE is the earliest of the sources, and they're often spoken of together, although they were probably originally separate traditions, or at least they, these traditions may have been
everything that I've been taught is that J was separate, E, and then later, probably around the time of Hezekiah, were they combined.
Very possibly. Yeah. So, but these are, and certainly, one of the points that Weinfeld makes is that D draws, particularly on the Elohist source. Um, I don't want to get too much in the weeds on all of this, um, but as he's showing, a part of the problem of this is not just that we don't know where these places are, but the various traditions are, in fact, various traditions. They come from different sources. There are early sources. I think it's important to recognize that there is a tradition of Israelites wandering through the desert, and there's an overall sense of where they went, except since we don't know the place names, we don't know precisely where they went. And that when we look at some of these contradictions and inconsistencies, we see that, aha, this is where we see the shiluv, the gathering, the putting together of different sources. So, one, we have this source in Deuteronomy, which very much reflects the itinerary in the priestly source in Numbers. Even though there are differences, it certainly is reflective of that. The itinerary style is presented, however, in the style of J.E., and here he just uses an example of the language, and points to a text that reflects that. But he goes, so the itinerary is styled in the style of J.E., go on, and not.
From there they marched, and not in the style of the priestly source, which has the stereotype that they set out and encamped.
Yeah, different words. Instead of Misham Nisa'u, Vayetsu, Vayachanu. I mean, just the different Hebrew words. It's, when we talk about the different texts, one of the mechanisms by which scholars were able to identify, or they identified different text, was through the unique language that was used. There are certain words that only appear in certain sources. There are certain words that only appear in other sources. And sometimes the style only works in one, is very clear in one source, and we see a different style in another, and that often comes through the different vocabulary. So sometimes if we're reading something and we're a little confused, it could be that there are a number of sources that are combined here. Go on.
Also,
Also,
the order of the encampments is different. In Numbers, the order is Mosera.
yeah, we don't have to go through the order. He says there are also slight variations in the name of the places. Go on.
Okay.
Finally, according to the Deuteronomic.
Finally, according to the Deuteronomic account, Aaron died and was buried in Mosera, where accordingly to the priestly account, he died and was buried in Hor Haha. It is obvious that this itinerary is independent of the priestly itinerary in Numbers 33. It is similar to the itinerary of the J.E. source, which is less stereotypic than the itinerary in Numbers 33. Thus, we find here that the wells of Bnei Yakan is less stereotypic. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. There we find here the wells of Bnei Yakan, whereas in Numbers 33, 31, and 32, Bnei Yakan appears without wells. Similarly, Yotbatah is defined in verse 7 as a land of streams of water, which is lacking in Numbers 33, 34. Such as characterizations of the encampments are typical of the JE itineraries and of the Mesopotamian itineraries as well.
So with all of that, he's basically saying that though there are clear similarities with priestly sources, the language here very much reflects earlier sources, one of the so it's characteristic vocabulary, and as well has a tendency to add some details about the place, which is not necessarily true in some of the other sources. And it's not just in biblical sources, but also Mesopotamian itineraries as well. So basically, he's understanding this, that we're dealing with different traditions. And even within the Torah itself, we have a number of different traditions. And what's important here, I would say, is that we recognize that when we distinguish different traditions within Torah, it's not just willy-nilly, but it's very careful understanding of the vocabulary and the style.
But
So
remember, Papi, there are places, especially in Sefer Bereshit, where you really get a feeling of things getting pretty willy-nilly. Like, you
well,
tell me
yeah,
how you can proceed to distinguish between J and E in Parshas Vayetze. It's impossible. I mean, the only way it can be done is deciding you take the scissors, and anytime a word shows up that you don't want it to be there, you cut it out. I just happen to notice that the Torah.com is now offering us a Sefer Bereshit with all that done for you, l'chatchila for $35.
yeah,
You probably are getting it in your mails right now.
yeah.
I mean, so to me, that's not that kind of scholarship is not scholarship. It's I don't know what it is. It's more like solving a jigsaw puzzle, but it definitely is not. You really have to do as a point is realize when the scholars tend to go overboard, and I'm going to quote myself, but I introduced myself to you by saying this about 10 years ago. The Tanakh is too important to be left to the scholar.
Yeah. I mean, but I think it's also, we see that even in the language of Weinfeld, who has probably studied Deuteronomy as carefully as anyone, there's
There's
a lot of words. Pardon me?
theory works, but there are other times when a documentary theory won't. Now you put it up, or excuse me, hypothesis. You're forcing the hypothesis on the text rather than the other way around. And a point is reached where you have to basically say what works in some places doesn't work in others. And, don't try to fit everything into this pre-existing lies.
Yeah. And important to remember that the documentary hypothesis is just that, a hypothesis. We can talk about the documents of J, E, P, and D, and we may even be able to agree that the general characteristics that scholars have used to identify these strands of tradition, have a great deal to recommend themselves. But it doesn't always work. It breaks down. And that makes sense because we have to remember that these texts were transmitted both orally and in writing. And there's a question of like how much, and the Jewish scholarship has begun to look at this. I'm certainly not up on it. It probably began about 15 years ago as they started looking at carefully, what is the relationship between oral transmission and written transmission? How did those different forms of transmission affect each other? It's not necessarily a straight and clear oral transmission. It's not necessarily a straight and clear written transmission, that they can be influenced one by the other. So, we can talk about strands of tradition, but that's it. And it does become a little bit crazy. I was reading, it was many years ago. Oh, Blenkinsop, who did a volume on the Pentateuch for the Anchor Bible series, for the Anchor Bible reference series. And, it's good, but at times it just gets a little too, they try and pinpoint stuff that I'm not sure really works. Okay, let's take a look now. Coming after Weinfeld is Tigay's commentary. He's going to be making some of the same points.
Okay.
Carol, do you want to continue? At this point in Moses' narrative,
After the aftermath of the golden calf incident, the text digresses to mention Aaron's death. This is not part of Moses' narrative, since it refers to Israel in the third person instead of the first person plural or the second person that Moses used in Deuteronomy. It must be by a different narrator.
Okay, so that's another thing they will look at is that what are they speaking in first person? Are they speaking in second person? The problem is that
Several of those, you have several of those in intrusions. We had it last week as well.
right,
The material about the cities of refuge.
right. That's clearly an interpolation. The problem with some of that is Weinfeld talks about this in determining different strands within Deuteronomy. And he says there are times when, yes, they're using first person, and then there are times that they're using second person, and sometimes they seem to be mixed. Now, sometimes it could be that a later source is quoting an earlier source or another contemporary source, and other times it can just be stylistic. It may not mean anything. So, it is. So here, just looking at Tigay's note, he points out other passages that seem to be spoken by a narrator other than Moshe, and the phrase Israelites, Bnei Yisrael, which is not Deuteronomic, suggests that the passage is from another source, perhaps an itinerary of the type found in Numbers 3. And then he points out, that there are still differences, but sometimes we can pick up on these things. It's like when we're reading in Parashat Noach, and someone asks, like how many animals came on the ark? They came in two by two, which we all know. Except if we carefully read the text,
Seven
it's not
kosher.
always. It's 2 pairs of unclean, 7 pairs of clean, so how long did it rain? 40 days and 40 nights. How long was the boat going? A year. It's there are definite inconsistencies that sometimes do point to strands being woven together. But important to realize that they're being woven together, they're strands, and they're coming from a lot of shared traditions. So that, when we take a look at the different strands in Parashat Noach, we could certainly say that, okay, this definitely shows two different texts. I mean, two different texts. On the other hand, they do share a story about a flood and a story about Noach. So, sometimes there's a lot more that's shared than is different. Or what's shared is more important than the minor differences. Go on, since Aaron.
Since Aaron died 40 years after the golden calf incident, Numbers 33, the reason that his death is mentioned here must be to indicate that although he was spared at the time, he did not escape punishment for his role in Israel's idolatry. Like Moses, he died in the wilderness and never reached the promised land. The note was probably placed before verses 8 through 9 because Aaron was the high priest, and those verses deal with the priestly functions of the Levites. None of the places mentioned in these verses have been identified with certainty.
So again, to some extent, they are following the traditional Mefarshim is like, what is this section doing here? It's because they were talking about Aaron. They're talking about the Leviim, and so it was a logical place to put it in. Now, in the JPS, in the large JPS Torah commentary, the individual volumes, they have the commentary, and then at the end they also have these excurses where they take up different topics from within the book in greater detail. And here the beginning of his well, it's not the beginning, but within excursus 2 he talks about these different itineraries. He talks about here the inconsistencies. So here's go on with the difficulties.
The difficulties with the traditional attempts to harmonize these discrepancies have led critical scholars to posit separate literary sources for the conflicting data. In this view, each source had a different conception of the route and chronology of the Israelites' travels. Deuteronomy reflects one conception, assuming a visit to Kadesh in the second year and a
Circuit.
circuit of Sarah Dome, reaching all the way to the Gulf of Eilat. This is based on the JE source. A second priestly P conception, reflected in Numbers 33, has the Israelites visit Kadesh in the 40th year and proceed from there across the northern Arava to northern Edom. Each of these conceptions has a counterpart in the narratives of Numbers, which blend passages from J and E and some editorial notes from P. The conception that Israel sent scouts from Kadesh in the second year appears in Numbers 13, while that which says that Israel reached Kadesh in the 40th year appears in 20, but no single source thinks they visited Kadesh twice. Scholars have different ideas as to how each of these versions developed. One view is that the Israelites arrived in Canaan in two separate waves of migration, and that the two routes described in the sources reflect these two waves. Another is that each version reflects one of the routes used in monarchic times by nomads traveling between Egypt and Canaan.
Okay, so a lot of interesting theories, but at the end, I think it's also possible to say that the biblical authors or editors may not have cared about a clear explanation in the way that the scholars do. The scholars want to see how this could all fit together. And the biblical writers may not have had that same concern. You know, we don't need two waves of migration. We don't necessarily need this to reflect specific routes. This is simply a tradition of the Israelites wandering through the desert. And that is what we're preserving. So I think Yehudi is correct that sometimes the Tanakh is too important to be left in the hands of the scholars. That sometimes everyone's trying to find some explanation, and maybe there isn't, or a coherent explanation. They're trying to find all these things to cohere, and what the biblical authors are trying to do is just preserve these traditions and share them with the people. It may not be concerned about the discrepancies or, well, we got this from the court of King David, we got this from the court of Hezekiah. That may not be the highest concern in their writings. But here this has been, as Yehudi said, a crux. And it's just one verse, but it stands out because it brings out a number of contradictions between Deuteronomy and earlier sources. And also, I think, when we take a look at all of these different explanations, that, in some ways, the stuff that the scholars are talking about was already adumbrated by the traditional Mefarshim. They already picked up on stuff, and they knew this. So I wanted to look very quickly at one other verse that appears in our in Deuteronomy, which clearly has antecedents in earlier parts of the Torah. So first of all, Shel, do you want to go on?
Sure.
So you are to.
So you are to love the sojourner. The sojourners were you in the land of Egypt.
Yeah, that's the one from our parasha. V'ahavtam et hager, ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim.
Now, a sojourner, you are not to maltreat, you are not to oppress him. So sojourners were you in the land of Egypt.
Yeah, that's way back in Exodus. This is, already this and the next source are both part of Sefer HaBrit, the Book of the Covenant.
A
sojourner.
Oh yeah, a sojourner, you are not to oppress. You yourselves know the sojourner's feelings, for sojourners were you in the land of Egypt.
Okay, not surprisingly, they are, almost identical in their words. And then finally, we have one of the sections appears elsewhere, but a number of the sections in Vayikra.
Now, when the sojourns with you, a sojourner in the land, you are not to maltreat him. Like the native born among you, shall he be to you. The sojourner that sojourns with you, be loving to him as one like yourself. For sojourners were you in the land of Egypt. I am Hashem, your God.
So this is, a rather important law. Certainly, Deuteronomy is drawing on the earlier traditions. Anything in the earlier traditions that stand out that's not in the Deuteronomic statement?
About what subject, Professor Rabbi Poppy?
Well, when we talk about, first of all, I should take a step back. What is the language for how we're supposed to care about the sojourner?
Well, the Haftam is very confusing because what does it mean to love? I mean, we have to love God, but
Well, I think that's part
But
of it.
that's in Parshat Kedoshim too.
Yeah.
Yes, roughly Kem, Yager, Hagar B'Tof Hashem, V'Yahaftal Al Kamocha,
Kamocha.
Higerim Hayitem V'Yeretz Canaan.
yeah.
That's all in Parshat Kedoshim.
Yeah, that's Parshat Kedoshim,
Say,
but
how do you
also,
love them? I mean, it makes more sense to say you're not to maltreat them or oppress them because that's like a definite. But love is a little.
well, it's no different than Ve'ahavta l'orecha kamocha. What does that mean?
Well, that at least you love them as yourself, but that
What
doesn't.
does that mean?
I don't know.
Treat them the way you want to be treated,
Right. We
Well,
have
that's
Hillel.
the Christian take. We could
or don't do to them what you don't want done to you.
Yeah,
that's
Hillel's
okay.
formulation.
But it could also simply be meant to say, treat them as well as you would expect to be treated.
Yeah. Now, I think that actually pinning this down is a little bit difficult, but the point is, you don't want to mistreat another person, but that's applied both to your fellow Israelite as well as to a
Tell that to the
stranger.
snowflakes, Rabbi Poppy.
Pardon me?
Tell that to the snowflakes all over American campuses.
He's making contemporary.
Yeah, I'm not even going to go there because I will just shut you off.
No
Stop now. Stop now. I'm not interested in hearing it. Because I think it's one case where you know Jewish tradition, but you don't understand it. So enough. I'm tired of being silent. There are all kinds of horrible things going on in the world, and I think the Jewish community has not always responded correctly. Partly the snowflakes worried about everybody else, and partially ignoring some really horrible things that are going on within our own communities. So don't even get me started. I don't give sermons anymore, which is a failure. I have failed as a rabbi because I'm not bringing out what our tradition really teaches. And in the face of those people who think they understand it, whether on the right or the left, and they don't. So let's just take a look at the texts. I don't know what Ve'ahavta l'orecha kamocha means. The fact is, it's applied to fellow Israelites and it's applied to strangers. And of course, the strangers are part of a whole category of people who are, in fact, have no power. The ger yatom va'almana, that's a particular category. And all of them have to be treated well because they don't have power. Now, again, try to understand what love means. Let's take a look at what Tige has to say.
Befriends literally loves. As the final clause of the verse indicates, the verb refers to affection expressed in action.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
Affection expressed in action. And I think that's, when Hillel takes V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha and puts it in the negative, mashasanu alach, al tas lechaverach, that which is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor, that puts it in much more concrete terms. And then understanding who the stranger is.
The stranger, the resident alien. See comments. God's concern for strangers is also mentioned in Psalm 146:9. This is a digression prompted by verse 18. It seems to be an almost instinctive reaction to that verse. No sooner are strangers mentioned than Israel's duty toward them enters the mind.
And here he explains this is from an earlier place in his commentary. And who the resident alien is, the Ger. And again, the other emphasis here, what I was trying to get at before, and I didn't explain it well, yet he was correct. I didn't give any context. Not only did they use the term Vahavta, but Kiatem Yadatem et Nefesh Hager, the being. You understand the experience, for you were strangers. Israel's own experience as aliens in a foreign land is regularly cited to encourage fair and kind treatment of strangers in its own land. Note especially Exodus 23:9, which adds, for the feelings of the stranger, which we saw above. Interestingly, Weinfeld has a section here in his introduction on Deuteronomy, laws common to the priestly school and Deuteronomy, and he has a whole section on social matters, the resident alien. And he mentions that according to the priestly school, the resident alien and the native Israelite alike are required to observe the regulations of the Torah, because it is the person's residence in the land that subjects him to the religio-cultic ordinance. Residence in the land is deemed to be an automatic recognition of the God of the country on the part of the resident, and also entails the obligation to worship him. And he goes on to point out how much the priestly sources emphasize the full participation of the Ger in the religious life and the ritual life of the community, though obviously there are some differences. And
well, they don't have to observe positive commandments.
Right.
They just have to observe negative ones.
Right. They're absolutely differences. But in the positive commandments, if they want to observe certain things, then they have to go through circumcision. But Deuteronomy, is pointing out. Deuteronomy intentionally differentiates then between the Israelite fulfillment, of which it regards as exclusively binding on the holy people. And he uses the example that, we don't eat a treifa, but we can give it to the Ger. They can eat it. And it's a much more secular. So that's a little bit on V'ahavtam et Hager, which if you want to make it political, you absolutely can. I think it should be, but I'm not going to. Except my brief outburst, which I apologize.
For what it's worth, on your first half, not on the question of the Ger, the prevalent archaeological theory for the last 60 years, with refinements in that period, is that the exodus of the Egyptian experience was only by the tribe of Levi. That everybody else, maybe a little bit Shimon. My teacher Gewurtz suggested the fact that Shimon was incarcerated by Joseph reflects that Shimon, and they are the two tribes, Levi and Shimon, that do not have land. Shimonite land was swallowed up by Judah. So that's land is allocated to Shimon, but they end up not having it.
That's what the Rambam says, Professor. In other words, the very thing you're just saying as being presented by contemporary archaeologists is pretty much the thesis of Sefer Devrei Yamim.
the idea is that the Levites gave their history to the entire country.
The Rebbe thinks that the Levites never even, that's false around. I'm not telling you.
I mean, that's an archaeological theory, okay? I'm
Yeah,
not
no, but
saying
I'm saying you
right or wrong.
you have good source in the Tanakh to back it up. You don't need contemporary archaeology. In other words, that just adds on to something that Tanakh itself already said.
There are several ways of looking at the Tanakh. Look at what's his name? Hold on one second. Jacob Wright. Wright, Why the Bible Began. And then Sydney Crawford on her material on from her studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the fact of duplication in material, and the whole thought that the actual crystallization, or I don't want to call it canonization, but the putting into concrete of the Tanakh doesn't take place till the destruction of the Second Temple.
We were talking about that last week, remember?
That's it's. But you see some of this, all the difficulties, the different traditions contradicting each other, and the fact that in the Dead Sea Scrolls you have the harmonization between different materials, where basically scribes feel that they have the right to add material. We know that we talked about that with Isaiah Kos Kubat as example. It's obviously the whole thing is more complicated than any of these various theories, but it's I'm not teaching, except to religious school students, the traditional story.
I got to go. Take care.
I teach one thing to religious school students. To adults, I say it's a whole lot more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also the what we have written in the Tanakh, and how we read it religiously, and scholarly theories are what is the actual history behind it.
Right.
Like.
But I don't see. I regard myself as being schizophrenic, so I have no.
Well, I think that's our role as rabbis. In many ways, we want to be able to teach it from.
Shabbos is one thing. Shabbos and holidays is one thing, and Torah study on Tuesdays or Thursdays is something completely different.
It's we used to joke at the seminary that you have to have 2 glasses every morning. One is filled with Torah, the other is filled with Wissenschaft. And that was the seminary.
Look at Dudukon David Ben Gad HaKohen on the Torah.com.
Yeah,
I didn't realize how much he's written. He's a historical geographer.
Yeah, I don't know if I downloaded that yet. I have to look through my sources here. But yeah, interesting stuff. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Shabbat Shalom. I apologize again for my outburst. I'm dealing with a great deal of frustration in the world. So I'm sorry. I don't mean to take it out on anyone, because everyone is entitled to his or her position. There are multiple positions, and there's right on both sides. There's wrong on both sides, but I still feel there's much more that we as Jews could be doing, and I feel that I'm guilty. I think I'm just expressing my own personal.
As I've put it, we've been given an assignment by Hashem, and we have not fulfilled it, to teach Torah to the world.
Yep.
Whichever version of Torah it is.
Yeah. So take care, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom. Yasha.
Shalom. And as much as possible, be well.